In this lecture, I will talk about the Minjung political movement. Minjung is a Korean term that means people. I will explain what the artists who participated in this movement were trying to express in their work, which is called people's art, or Minjung Miso. Let me begin by providing some background information on the economic and political development of post-war Korea. Well into the mid-20th century, South Korea was a predominantly agrarian society. Light and heavy industry factories established by the Japanese colonizers had been destroyed during the Korean War. Here in this picture, you see a woman dressed in a traditional hanbok, Korean clothes, loading cabbage onto her ox. The cabbage would eventually be used for making kimchi. This picture of rural Korea was taken in the 1950s, when South Korea was still recovering from the devastating effects of the Korean War. In the 1960s and 1970s, the South Korean government heavily subsidized business conglomerates referred to as chaebol, such as Hyundai or Samsung. With the intent of catching up with industrialized nations, these chaebol companies exploited their workers. This development was put forward by repressive military dictators such as Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, who pursued the politics of anti-communism, U.S. reliance, authoritarianism, and developmentalism. In the late 1970s and 1980s, a group of South Korean political activists revolted against the regime. Risking imprisonment and torture, these intellectuals and college students organized demonstrations such as the one you can see here in front of the Jeolla provincial government building in 1980. They criticized the repressive military dictatorships, the rapid and dislocating process of industrialization, and patronizing interventions by the US. University students would become activists who went into the factories and into the countryside to ally with impoverished farmers and workers and encourage them to fight for their rights. Together, they demanded freedom of speech, democracy, and unification. What did Minjung artists criticize in particular? They criticized the exploitation of the workers. For example, Hong Song-dam's expressionist work Night Shift shows the working conditions in a clothing factory. Workers hunched over sewing machines as though they were cooped up in cages. In the lower front, the artist depicted a female worker taking medicine with a glass of water or tea, while a person at the lower right is depicted coughing blood due to physical exhaustion. In the background, a man yawns while trying to stretch his body behind the sewing machine. In this work, Hong shows the horrible working conditions in South Korea's textile industry in the 1980s. Minjung artists also criticized the uncritical adoption of American culture. And you already looked at an example. You already looked at Pak Pul-ttong's work, in which he mocks the impact of US culture, which seemed, in his eyes, to threaten the existence of rural communities in Korea. In the upper part of the picture, the artist depicted the face of a Western-looking woman rising above the horizon on the sea. In doing so, the artist perhaps criticizes the fact that with the import of US culture came also the import of Western standards of beauty. Below the woman's face is a hodgepodge of American consumer products such as cigarettes, junk food, and the Statue of Liberty, which symbolizes the United States. Two stereotypically Western men dressed in fancy suits appear to be disembarking from a ship carrying these US consumer goods to the shores of Korea. In the center of the image, Korean farmers are depicted working in their fields, either manually or with tractors, seemingly unresponsive to what the artist perceived as the invasion of US culture. Separated from the farmers by an empty space, a glass and a bottle of whiskey and golf clubs depicted at the lower right point to the Western-style consumption of Korea's upper middle class. With this image, the artist not only criticized the uncritical adoption of American culture in Korea, but he also points to the cultural and economic imbalance between urban and rural life. Another thing that the Minjung artist criticized was uprooting. And this is an example for this kind of topic, Kim Pong-jun's woodblock print, in which he points to the negative effects of industrialization in Korea. In the upper part of the print, you see young people who left their hometowns to work in the cities. And you can see in their faces, they don't look very happy. They are separated from the old and very young members of their family who stayed in the countryside and are depicted in the bottom portion of the print. With this picture, Kim vividly demonstrates the effects of industrialization, such as migration to the cities, uprooting, and the separation of families. Minjung activists not only criticized the current living conditions of the Koreans. They not only opposed military dictatorship and strived for political liberalization. They also imagined new forms of social and economic relationships free from the alienation of capitalism. So their solution to cultural uprooting was the rediscovery of Korean traditional values and traditions. In this woodblock print, you can see how the Minjung artist Kim Pong-jun envisioned the future of the Korean people. He wanted Koreans to rediscover and appreciate their own traditional culture, which is why he employed woodblock printing, a traditional Korean art form. He was also one of the Minjung artists who initiated the performance of traditional Korean mask dance and traditional drum music, both of which you can see here depicted in this print. The engagement in traditional cultural activities was believed to help Koreans to reverse the process of alienation and rediscover their own culture. In conclusion, people's art, or Minjung Misul, was a proletarian movement led by students and intellectuals seeking to motivate people to rise against their oppressors. Together they demanded freedom of speech, democracy, and unification. One of the major themes in their works was the suffering of the people. Their works reveal that the thriving economy of today's Korea came at a price. People suffered from the effects of rapid industrialization under a suppressive regime. In terms of topic and also in terms of style, these works that I just showed you are quite similar to the prints of Käthe Kollwitz or the murals by Diego Rivera. Minjung artists were political activists who criticized the established art scene for being non-political and even collaborating with the dictatorial regime. Minjung artists also criticized the established art scene's orientation towards Western styles and Western art movements. Minjung artists were basically anti-American, anti-Western. They emphasized traditional Korean values and traditional Korean culture. In contrast to the elitist art scene in South Korea from the 1950s to 1980s, Minjung artists collaborated with farmers and workers. Together they produced art. Together they promoted traditional Korean culture such as mass dance and traditional Korean farmers' music because they believed that Koreans could rediscover their identity by engaging in traditional arts. So the 1990s identity crisis in Korea that we discussed in the previous unit had its antecedents in the 1980s in the form of the Minjung movement.